Good evening, MOCA friends. My name is Yifan Wu, pronounced Daden, Director of Programs and Chief of Staff at the Museum of Chinese in America. Honoring National Immigrant Heritage Month, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this special conversation with Michelle T. King, an Associate Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and author of Chop, Fry, Watch, Learn, Fu Pei-mei and the Making of Modern Chinese Food. This talk will illustrate a spirited new history of Chinese food told through the remarkable life of Fu Pei-mei, the woman who brought Chinese cooking to the world. Beginning as a novice housewife in Taiwan in 1949, Fu transformed into a renowned cookbook author and TV instructor over 4 decades. Inspired by her personal connections to Fu's cookbooks, Professor Kim creates rich narratives to highlight the evolution of Chinese cooking as both a continuation of tradition and a response to modern influences such as the increased female workforce, media evolution, kitchen innovations, and fluctuating diplomatic dynamics between China and Taiwan. The conversation will be moderated by Kim Lam Ko, author of the award-winning cookbook, Phoenix Clouds and Jade Trees, Essential Techniques of Authentic Chinese Cooking. We also encourage you to submit questions anytime during the discussion for the Q&A. This event is also being recorded for on-demand viewing on MOCA's YouTube channel. If you enjoy tonight's program, please consider supporting MOCA. Your generosity is vital to our institution and helps us create future programs that inspire and uplift diverse communities. You may donate on our website at mocanyc.org. And also, if you're interested in the talk, please purchase Professor King's book, Chop, Fry, Watch, Learn, at michelletking.com, and you will be able to find various options to purchase the book. And we encourage you to, buy the book from your local bookstore. We look forward to sharing Fu's epic journey of becoming a global culinary icon and celebrating the enduring legacy of her cookbooks as cherished symbols of cultural heritage within the Chinese diaspora. So now, without further ado, I will hand it over to Kian to start the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Okay, well, thank you, Neil, for that introduction, and welcome, Michelle. Michelle, you have to unmute yourself. Okay, so this is an amazing book that you had just authored. I read through it, and it was just amazing. The research that you put into it, and the details, about the whole social and political background where Fu Pei-mei created her career and so on. It was a great way to put context into her work. And it's great for me to be able to talk to you here in MOCA, and we're really excited. So let's start about talking at how you come about to be involved in the project. You talk about how you learn cooking in your book, and let's share that with us. Tell us how you started doing that, and what Fu Pei-mei's cookbook mean to you.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I know when you asked me the question, how did I actually learn how to cook? I can think of this story of, when I was growing up, it was my mom, mostly my mom, and also my dad cooking. My mom is an excellent home cook of a lot of Chinese dishes, so I never really cooked very much. When I went to college, I ate in a dorm. But then when I went to study abroad in Germany, that was the first time that I actually had to cook for myself. And I distinctly remember over the summer, I wanted to eat eggplant. I could think of the, glistening purple skin and how delicious it is with garlic, when it comes to you in a Chinese restaurant. So I bought some eggplant and I made it, and it was awful. It was brown and gloppy and like inedible. I still ate it all because I, had spent the money on the eggplant. But I remember calling my mom from a phone booth because those were the days before cell phones or internet or anything.
Right. Uh-huh.
And I was like, I don't know what happened. This eggplant was terrible, and how am I supposed to make it? And she said, Well, if you want to know how to cook Chinese food, maybe you should try some recipes from Fu Pei-mei's cookbook. And
Uh-huh.
actually, that cookbook was a cookbook I had grown up knowing because it was on my mom's shelf. I looked at it when I was a kid because there's great color
Right.
photos. I would look through it. And it's also bilingual, so it's both in Chinese and English. And so I could read the English parts. I couldn't read the Chinese at the time. I can read it now, but so I just knew that and her cookbook cover, for those of you who know it or don't know it, it says in very big letters. I actually have a copy here. Um,
Yeah, I have a copy here too.
you know, huge, in huge letters, Pei-mei's Chinese cookbook, very iconic. You won't, once you've seen the cover, you know it. And so I always thought of this person, Pei-mei, as a cookbook author. So it wasn't until after I had my own kids that, I was like, geez, I really want to cook Chinese food for them. So I happened to have all the cookbooks, Pei-mei's cookbooks on my shelf. My mom had given me some of hers. I had acquired some through used bookshops and things like that. And I was looking back through her cookbooks once again, as an adult, and to look for recipes, easy ones that I could make or something like that. And when I looked through her cookbook again, I realized that not only were there these Technicolor photos of all the dishes, not only were there, it also contains all these, recipes, bilingual recipes. There were also many photographs of Fu Pei-mei doing stuff, traveling the world, teaching foreign students, meeting
Hmm.
VIPs like Jiang
Hmm.
Qingguo, the then president of the Republic of China and Taiwan. There were also photographs of, hundreds of newspaper clippings about her from
Hmm.
all over the world in various languages. And when I saw those photos, the light bulb went off in my head and I thought, gosh, maybe there's more to this woman, than I know. And because by that point I'd been trained as a gender scholar, a Chinese scholar of Chinese gender history, it was really appealing to me to do research on a woman and make a woman's voices the center of this story. So throughout this story, it's not just Fu Pei-mei's voice that I center, it's also centered on a lot of female home cooks. And that was really
Hmm.
important to me to make this a story about home cooking. So it wasn't until after I started doing research for the book that I realized, geez, not only did she write all these cookbooks, she had been on television for 40 years in Taiwan, from the start of the medium in 1962 until her retirement in 2002. And so the more I learned about her, the more I thought, this is an amazing woman, and there's so much that we can talk about through her life story and career. Um, you know, that many of the topics that you have already mentioned, but I knew it would be a wonderful way to kind of introduce just ordinary readers to Taiwan's modern history, but also get at all these social changes that have happened, and to do it through food, which of course, who doesn't love to eat? And do it through this appealing figure of someone like Fu Pei-mei, who wore so
Hmm.
many hats in the course of her long career and who did so many things that it enabled me to talk about all of these different topics, like the media, changing gender roles, Taiwan's changing place in the international arena, kitchen technologies, all kinds of stuff. So, yeah, that's how this journey started. Basically, is I just wanted to cook food for my kids. So,
Hmm. Hmm. So during this whole process of research and so on, you did talk to Fu Pei-mei's children, right? And are they here in the U.S. now? The
so
the three children?
yeah, she has three children, two daughters and a son. One daughter and one son are in Taiwan, in Taipei. I just came back from Taiwan and I just had dinner with them last week, actually. So,
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
and then one of the daughters is in Florida, and so the children in Taiwan have had more to do with kind of like keeping up her legacy, and her older daughter continues to teach cooking classes herself. For a long time, she was Fu's assistant on Taiwan television as well. So
Hmm.
they
Hmm.
kind of done a lot to keep their mother's legacy alive.
Alive. Hmm. That's great. So, so let's start a little from the beginning as to how Fu ended up in Taiwan, because she was originally born in northeastern China, right? In Dalian. Is that where she was born? Yeah. How did she end up in Taiwan from there?
Yeah. So she was born in Dalian, which at the time was occupied by the Japanese. So her father was a Japanophile. He did sort of import-export
Hmm.
business with Japanese traders. And so he loved Japan and he sent her to a Japanese school, actually. So her
Hmm.
schooling was entirely in Japanese. So she was, fluent in many languages, Japanese being the chief one. But this was, during the war against Japan. And after the war against Japan was concluded and the communists and the nationalists started to have their own internal civil war, things were messy and uncertain. And so her father and older brother went looking for work, other business in other parts of China. They eventually went to Taiwan. And as a teenager, she decided with her older sister-in-law that they wanted to go looking for their brother and father, and wanted to follow them. So for a period of several years, she was kind of like wandering around northern China, staying with relatives at times, sort of going to school in Beijing at other times. But it's kind of chaotic period during the war.
Hmm. Right.
Eventually, around 1949, she and her sister-in-law get on a boat and, like so many other wartime refugees, go to Taiwan. So that split up the family. So effectively, she, her brother, her sister-in-law, and her father were in Taiwan, and the rest of
Mm.
her siblings and mom remained in mainland China for many, many years.
Right.
Um, so that's how she got started. And the really interesting thing about Fu is that she has no particular connection to food. It's not like she comes from a foodie family, or it's not like she's like, you know, um, really well connected with somebody who's a gourmand or anything like that. That's what makes her a really interesting figure, is that she really was a self-made woman in terms of her culinary career. So,
Hmm.
other, the long history of Chinese food writing is all about men and gentlemen literati writing about food and
Right.
pleasurable enjoyment. Um,
Right.
but they're not cooking it, right? Their chefs do that for them, right? They're talking about enjoying eating it. They don't talk about
Right.
sort of like cookbook-ish things, but they're not really
Right.
for the cook. So when she and her cohort of other women come along in post-war Taiwan, it is really something very different to have all of them writing all these cookbooks and how-to books for other women, right? That just simply was not something that was very common up to that point. So,
Hmm.
there are some earlier cookbooks and things in the Republican era or whatever, but this era of the really well-known celebrity cooking instructor, which she was, that's really a post-war phenomenon, I think, aided by
Hmm.
media.
Hmm. And she actually uh at, towards the end she actually do has done a lot of um teaching in overseas as well. So I think for example, I think she did a lot of Japanese television program as well, right? And she spoke in Japanese for all those programs.
Yeah,
And I guess her Japanese education helped her in uh, able to extend her career into the Japanese market as well. So
yeah.
I thought that's really amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really quite interesting because you can tell in her autobiography how enamored she too was of Japan, because she was like, oh, the Japanese, they do everything perfectly and efficiently. And so she was contracted to have her own Chinese cooking program on Fuji television in Japan. She would fly
Hmm.
over every couple of months to do some episodes. And she was like, the comparison between how things were handled in Japan and how they were handled in Taiwan was night and day. So that she would get like the Golden Glove 4-star, 5-star treatment or whatever in Japan, all the ingredients would be prepared for her. Everything was immaculate, only the best ingredients. And in Taiwan, even to up till the end, like she had to buy all her own ingredients, bring all her own stuff, bring all these costume changes because they would tape multiple episodes in it.
Right.
And she said, it was just totally night and day, and the Japanese were so professional. And so she really had very fond memories of her, just of Japan and of her Japanese education, such as it was. And she spent some time there studying at a nutrition university, in the 1970s. Um, but her reach wasn't limited to Japan. What's really interesting is that when you know nowadays people can go on to YouTube and see like hundreds of episodes of her program because Taiwan Television
Mm-hmm.
uploaded more than 700 episodes of her program from the 1980s,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Fu Pei-mei time. But when I started the research for this book, it did take me 10 years, so it was a long time. But when I started the research for this book, there were no episodes of her on YouTube, with the
YouTube.
exception
Uh-huh.
with the exception of episodes of Fu Pei-mei's program that had been dubbed into Tagalog. So, at the time of the broadcast, her Taiwan Television, sold the program to a channel in the Philippines, ABN, and they would broadcast her program dubbed in Tagalog. So lots of Filipinos have very fond memories of Fu Pei-mei as well. And so you'll see in the comments on what's been uploaded to Fu Pei-mei now, or YouTube now, you see all these comments from Filipinos saying, "Oh, I loved watching her after school. We loved seeing her program." So you just see the ways in which she had all this influence in various parts of Asia and also traveled the world. She came to the United
Mm-hmm.
States, she went to Europe, she was often asked to go abroad by either food companies or the government itself if they had some like book exhibitions or they wanted
Mm-hmm.
to promote, like, say, Taiwan produced, foodstuffs or canned goods or whatever, they would have her come along and promote those things.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
she really was, and she considered herself a culinary ambassador.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right,
And
right,
she did fulfill that role for, throughout really starting in the 70s,
right.
80s. She really
Right.
did.
No, I agree. I mean, that's one of the accomplishment that you really did. So let's get back to, so what happened to her after she got to Taiwan and how she um, got interested in cooking. Can you just
Sure.
talk a little bit about how she got
Yeah.
interested
So,
in cooking at that
so
time?
At first, she was a typist because she learned how to use a Chinese style typewriter, which is totally different from a Western,
Right,
alphabetic typewriter. And, it's like a tray of characters and you have to push this select
right,
around and all this stuff.
right.
So she considered herself an office lady, actually, a working woman, even as a teen. And she was very proud of that time that she worked as an office lady. But after she got married, her husband loved to play mahjong, and he would invite his friends over to the house to play mahjong, and she was expected to cook for them. And she was a lousy cook. She did not know how to cook anything. She made like fried rice and fried noodles, and he would complain, like, "Why are you making the same thing all the time? Can't you make anything better? It's so embarrassing." And so, she was really embarrassed by that. And eventually, a few years later, she decided she would do something about it. And what she did was she hired a series of restaurant chefs in Taiwan, in Taipei, to teach her how to cook their signature dishes from their restaurants, right? So she would hire a chef from Hunan, a chef from Sichuan, a chef from Guangzhou, a chef from Jiangsu or Zhejiang, or a chef from Beijing, right? All of these different regional specialty chefs taught her, kind of the basics. I mean, to say teaching, it wasn't really like teaching because they're very reluctant to reveal any of their secrets. She said frequently
Right.
taking notes, she'd look down and they'd put something in there, so she didn't even see what they put in, right? She paid them money to come over and demo the dishes, but they were very reluctant to actually tell her how to teach how to make those dishes because
Right.
it's a secret, it's a trade secret for them. And so she just practiced a lot and she, just got better at it. And eventually she got so good at making, even the dishes of Jiangsu and Zhejiang, which is where all those mahjong players came from, that they were saying to their wives, hey, go learn a couple of dishes from Fu Pei-mei. She really knows how to make, those various dishes. And so, basically, she started cooking because of that, or cooking classes because of that, because all these women were coming to ask her anyway how to make such and such dishes. So she also felt bad about spending all her dowry on hiring all these chefs, so she wanted to earn some of the money back. So she like put up little posters. She hired a trishaw to ride around and put up posters around Taipei. And her husband was so unsupportive. He was like, I don't want strangers in my house. So, to comply with his wishes, she had a tent erected in their backyard and she taught cooking classes in a tent in the backyard,
Hmm.
when she first got started, because he just couldn't countenance. He really didn't like her working anyway. He preferred her to stay at home.
Hmm.
So, even
And
after
be a housewife.
yeah, and be a housewife. And even after she
Hmm.
got on television, he was like, you don't need to go on television. I make enough money for both of us. Why you
Hmm.
gotta go on television? But by then, she felt like she liked it and she, had created this career for herself. But anyway, that's how she got her
Hmm.
start.
Hmm.
So after she started those cooking classes, then some of her students were like, hey, they're looking for people to demonstrate cooking on Taiwan television because that was started in 1962. So a few years, prior to that, she had started these cooking classes.
How
So
did she get that connection?
yeah, I'm not exactly sure, but I think it's because she taught a lot of elite women, right? A lot of her students,
Hmm.
I mean, it's expensive to take classes. You have to have leisure time to do it.
Right. Right.
So her first batch of students were from very elite Taiwan families. Um, she also, knew all these uh, you know, uh, had connections with American military wives, which I talk about in another chapter. But I wouldn't be surprised if, some of her elite students knew people in high places and then therefore
Hmm.
said, hey, how about you try out for, Taiwan television? But also another thing that I uncovered in my research was that she was not the only, cooking show host at the time. There were at least
Right.
a dozen other women, who were also on the show. They rotated. It was a weekly program, and they rotated who would come and demonstrate stuff. But
Hmm.
over a couple of years, she rose to the top and became the face of Chinese cooking on Taiwan television. So I think that's due to a lot of
Why do you think she's more successful than the other presenters?
well, for one thing, I think that she actually is an attractive young woman. That's not going to hurt you on television, right? But for another thing, I think the big thing was that when I was reading through all the Taiwan, basically the equivalent of TV guide for Taiwan television, the editorials would say she's so clear in how she explains things. She tells you every little single secret and tip. She knows how to tell you exactly what to do. She had the practice of teaching classes. Um, and I think also it's also a skill to be able to move your hands and talk at the same time. Can you must know this because cooking instruction yourself or
Right.
doing videos and stuff. You can't just sit there and chop. You have to fill the airtime with
That's right.
like info and then like also point out what you're doing, but you also have to have prepared and say, oh, like you could use this fish for this dish or that thing or whatever. So
Right.
she was just very good at doing all that at once. And I
Hmm.
think that's one of the reasons. Also, she spoke Mandarin it wasn't super accented. That was something appealing to the ruling Nationalist Party, right? Because they wanted to promote
Hmm.
Mandarin as a national language of Taiwan.
Right.
And she was a quick study. She also spoke Japanese, she also spoke Taiwanese as well. So, there were a lot of different reasons that ended up that, but I think a lot of it is that she worked really hard, and she was very good at talking and cooking at the same time, right?
Hmm.
You know, I think if it had not been for her, certainly another person would have come along to fit this niche because this was
Hmm.
a need on the part of Taiwan television, but it happened to be her. And I think
Right.
part of that was, yeah, she just had a really kind of um, just a really practical approach to teaching people how to cook.
Hmm.
One
No,
of the
I must admit that, I think she's a great teacher because if you look at her video, you can tell, just like what you said, there is no in a silent uh, period in her presentation. It's she's always talking about something, and it's very and it's true. She's very clear. She'd explain every little technique and methods and tips and so on. So you're right. It is you can tell if you watch some of her videos, you can tell that she is excellent. She's really good as a presenter on a TV show like that. So yeah. So okay. So from there, she started uh, writing the cookbook. So at first she wrote for the television program, right? And then she created her own book, which she actually self-published, I believe, right?
that's
Um, and and also, I guess it was also a revolutionary type of publishing because she made it a color photograph, included color photograph in her books, and make it really a luxury, hardcover book. So tell us a little bit more about
Yeah.
how
So,
that.
it's a really, that cookbook is basically why I started doing this research project in the first place. Because to me, as a historian, the idea of having this bilingual text, a bilingual artifact is like, why? Why should it be bilingual? That's the first question. And so the answer is because at the time, as I mentioned before, she wasn't just teaching housewives in Taiwan, she was also teaching um, American military wives because
Mhm.
at the time the US still had diplomatic relations with Taiwan, and they considered, quote unquote, free China on Taiwan to be the legitimate government of China. And so they sent a lot of military aid and a lot of military advisors to Taiwan. And so military, like Air Force men or whatever would go and be stationed there, and their wives sometimes came along. And those military wives, one of the things they wanted to do was learn how to cook Chinese food. And who taught those classes? Fu Pei-mei. So
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
those American military wives urged her to make like she would have mimeographed sheets or something like that for the cooking class content, right?
Mhm.
So they encouraged her to make the cookbook. So the cookbook was really initially conceived of as basically the textbook for her cooking classes. So all
Mhm.
the dishes they
Mhm.
had in the textbook were dishes they actually taught in the cooking school. And so that would give students a really easy way to take notes and to, kind of just have everything written down in terms of ingredients and amounts and everything like that. But she did make it really fancy. And her daughter-in-law told me that was with the idea in the mind, in the back of their heads, like, um, to have all these color photographs and to have it be bilingual and wherever they wanted American military wives to purchase this expensive, for at the time it was expensive cookbook to give as gifts back home, right? So
Mhm.
there was an
Mhm.
idea that this would go far and travel. And so she was really savvy in terms of that marketing. And because she made the decision to make it into a bilingual text, even though she said her English wasn't very good, Recently, a retired woman here in Chapel Hill who met Fu Pei-mei while she was in Taiwan in the 60s said actually her English was fine and she could teach in her cooking classes just fine in English, but Fu herself said, well, her written English wasn't very good. She didn't know all the words. So she asked one of the military wives to help her translate, refine
Hmm.
the translations of her first cookbook. And
Hmm.
so that was really interesting to me as well, because when you read the Chinese and the English, in the first volume particularly, it's not at all an exact translation. It's kind of like a vaguish summary because, the woman who did it didn't know any Chinese. So, probably Fu Pei-mei told her what was in it and she just wrote that down, like I think
Right, right.
that's how that kind of came about. So it's a really interesting artifact from that Cold War moment, right? Because it has both the Chinese and English, but because
Hmm.
of the English, that is how her cookbook traveled around the world, right? That's why the New York Times, called her the Julia Child of Chinese cooking in 1971 because they could read the English part, right? That made her
Right.
cookbook travel in a way that other cookbooks, another cookbook author from Taiwan, Huang Yuanshan, who was very popular in the 1950s, right? Her cookbooks were all in Chinese. They were never going to go anywhere because, only people in Taiwan and China or in Singapore and Hong Kong, I guess, could read the Chinese. So
Right.
her decision to make that into a bilingual text gave her book legs to go
Hmm.
around the world. And so that's another absolutely fascinating part of this whole story is that's what makes the cookbook accessible to, people like me, a second generation kid growing up in the United States, looking at this cookbook on my mom's shelf. I can read it because it's in English, right? I couldn't read the Chinese at the time. So it's really fascinating to me the way that it becomes this kind of artifact of this trans-Pacific journey.
Hmm. So how do you see her as a woman, a Chinese woman at that period in the history of Asian women freedom and women struggle and so on? How do you see that? I mean, she, I mean, her husband wasn't very supportive, but yet she was able to really persist and actually create this career on her own.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah, she's an interesting bundle of contradictions. That's what I also find really interesting because she's not like a bra-burning, feminist out there that we would think of in
Hmm.
an American mold at all, right? She doesn't use
Right.
the word feminism. That's not part of her vocabulary. But I feel like all along she was very supportive and understanding of women and the burdens that domestic burdens that they're always placed under. She didn't say, oh, women shouldn't work. She said, oh, there's so many more working women now. I have to change my recipes to suit modern lifestyles, right? So we don't choose
Hmm.
all these slow cooking dishes that take 3 days to make or whatever, but the focus might be on quick dishes, on things that don't take that long. And she was really recognized that her audience, working women and housewives in Taiwan, needed that kind of flexibility. So, and also she was like, she worked with food companies and food industries to market things like instant ramen and stuff like that.
Right.
She wasn't a purist in terms of, um, like thinking of, I don't know, I don't know who would be a home cooking guru nowadays who would be like, oh, you have to make it all from scratch or whatever, right? She wasn't like that. So I think of her in terms of her as a kind of a figure of gender identity is really in that transitional moment in the mid-century, right? Where she's not allowed really to have other, women are making careers for themselves, but they're in areas that have been deemed as, okay for women to do. So because of her expertise in the kitchen as a housewife, that's where her career expands. And that was true of many women at the time as well. Like I interviewed Susanna Fu, who's a very well-known chef in the Philadelphia area, and she also took classes
Hmm.
with Pei-mei. And she told me, Michelle, when I started, I just wanted to be a good housewife. I just wanted to make, dishes for my kids and
Hmm.
husband and entertain guests. And then, she's
Hmm.
parlayed that later in her life to be a James Beard award-winning chef, owning her own restaurant. I mean,
Right.
part of that is simply like, well, that's the area in which you have this skill, so that's what's going to grow. But I really think it's just fascinating kind of how those women navigated all those demands, right? She didn't ever own her own bank account. Everything was in her husband's name. She always had to ask him for pocket money. There were things she said later that she were really quite unreasonable, that he was such a chauvinist. He didn't allow her to have her own money, but she did it, and she still managed to have this amazing career. So I
Career. Yeah.
that's the really interesting part about her as this kind of mid-century female figure, right? She didn't use the word feminist, um, but I think that's just really interesting to think about all the different ways in which women
Hmm.
are kitchen cooking for family. It's both a pleasure and it's a burden, right? So
Hmm.
all these different things are bound up in cooking.
How about politically? How is she? Um, I mean, I know that she's very active in promoting Chinese food all over the world, and you know, how is she politically as far as navigating through that whole era of
Yeah.
turmoil in Taiwan and you know,
Well, it's really interesting because certainly the way she's regarded probably has changed over these decades, right? In the 80s, 70s and 80s and into the 90s, there's the growing nativization movement, or just the
right?
rise of a native Taiwanese identity, and
Hmm.
political parties that were not the Nationalist Party, which had been, come over from mainland China. But, democratization meant the proliferation of different political ideas, and with that, the rise of kind of a native Taiwanese identity. So there's a scholar a food scholar in Taiwan, who talks about the shift from the era of Fu Pei-mei to the era of Aji, who is a native,
Ajisu,
yeah, like a
yeah,
TV chef who's very Taiwanese, or kind of
right,
natively Taiwanese. So there has
right.
been shift in recognition of who she is and what she did, but nonetheless, I feel like she's such a crucial part of Taiwan's post-war history that we can't really ignore, you know, um,
Hmm.
her contributions, but it's just really interesting to think about because, for example, one Taiwan uh, scholar that I know, when I told her I was writing this book about Fu Pei-mei, she was just like, you know, why you write about her kind of attitude because she's a mainlander or whatever. And
Right.
this
She's wise and Ren. Yeah.
yes, this woman had very strong, Taiwanese identity and feelings. And I think, well, I think what's interesting is that Fu's story and life can encompass all of that, right? I still write about
Right.
all of that in my book because I think it's important. And I think this shifting identity is an important part of Taiwan's modern history. So I
Right.
address that in the book. Um, and certainly, um, it's just a really interesting to think about, like, um, what how her legacy has changed, and how people might
Hmm.
think about her differently today. But I still think that just for so and what's interesting is that some uh, Taiwanese women write very explicitly about how much she meant to them, even though,
Hmm.
the dishes she cooked were mainlander dishes. They watched the program. They felt
Hmm.
like, oh, this is all very different and exciting food, but they felt this connection to her as this
Hmm.
televisual figure. So it's not black and white. It's not like, oh, Taiwanese don't like her and mainlanders do, or anything
Hmm.
like that. In fact, it's very mixed because she was on television for so long and she was such a grandmotherly and motherly figure. A lot
Hmm.
of fans developed a really deep attachment to her
Hmm.
as a kind of this food figure, because one woman who I quote in the book writes about how, her own mom was always busy working and could never make all these dishes, but Fu Pei-mei was reliable. You always saw her on television. She'd cook this great meal, and then you could go turn off the TV and go in the street and buy yourself some noodles, right? So that the emotional attachment that people developed with her as a
Mhm.
result of her being on television for so many decades is also part of that story. So I don't think it's certainly not black and white.
Mhm.
I
She
think
did embrace the Taiwanese nativism later on in her life, didn't she?
Yeah, she was always very curious about all kinds of food, and very curious to try new dishes and everything like that. And so, even though at the start her intentions in teaching people how to cook was initially teaching mainlanders how to get along in this new island environment, which they were all unfamiliar with, right? She wanted to teach them how to make the dishes that they were homesick for.
Mhm.
And later on in her career, she paid much more attention to what are people eating in Taiwan? What are Taiwanese foodways? As you told me yourself, she's never been known as a Taiwanese quote unquote cook,
Correct.
but she's a
Right.
mainland chef. That's true. But she
Right.
demonstrated the interest and, had all kinds of Taiwanese guests on her program all the time, you know, um, and even in the 80s, even came out with a cookbook with her daughter that was focused on Taiwanese cuisine. So it's not as if she wasn't interested. It's just it, was a growing thing for her.
Right. Right. You touch on the subject of how she started working with corporations and doing all sorts of corporate work um, later on in her career. Uh, Tell us a little bit more about that, and why did she started doing that?
Yeah, so she all along had a very, you get the feeling from reading her autobiography is that just a really open attitude towards experimenting. And in one article she wrote in the 80s, she was like, well, in the past, Chinese used drying and fermenting to preserve ingredients and make things last longer. Nowadays, we have new technologies like canning and vacuum packaging and retort packages. This is just, a new form of that preservation. So to her,
Hmm.
it was all kind of part and parcel of let's move with the times, right? We're not going to stay stuck in the past or whatever. She embraced a lot of kitchen technologies. The one thing she drew the line at was the microwave because she was like, you cannot put proper Chinese food in the microwave. And of course, that seems like a no-brainer. Who would try to do that?
Well, you
But
cannot cook
people did.
proper any food in microwave.
Yes, exactly. But the really amazing thing is when I look back at like advertisements from the 70s when the microwave was first introduced in Taiwan, they did market the thing as a replacement for your messy gas stove, right? You could get rid of that gas stove and cook everything in your microwave, which of course I think now people will think, well, that's ludicrous because you'll never get the control, right, that you need a heat. And that's what her reluctance was with the microwave. She's like, the control of heat over time is
Yeah.
impossible in a microwave, right? So, anyway, but from the 80s, there's lots of cookbooks that are microwave Chinese cookbooks. And I even found a microwave Peking duck recipe, which was really quite amazing. So anyway, so her involvement with food companies and technologies was really because by the end of her career, she said, well, with so many other kinds of foods coming into Taiwan, like Western foods and fast foods and all this other stuff, if we want to save Chinese food, we have to make it more convenient, right? People just don't have time to cook. So she said, at least if I help develop these, you know, whatever retort packaging, instant ramen or whatever, all these different things, at least people will have those Chinese tastes and flavors in that food. And that's what she wanted
Mhm.
to, she was really concerned about that people not just abandon Chinese food entirely for Western foods or other kinds of foods. She wanted people to have those tastes, but she recognized, yeah, Chinese cooking can be really laborious and like a lot of prep and a lot of work, right? So she wanted to try to make it easier, always,
Mhm.
of women and the burdens that they had. Yeah.
So she seems to be a very adaptable and very open in her thinking of preparing food and so on. So I think that's really quite amazing
Yeah,
to
I
see
think
her
she's
do
very
that.
pragmatic. Yeah, a very pragmatic woman
Yeah,
as
she is a very pragmatic person. Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about her legacy and how is the younger generation in Taiwan see her at this point, and what is her legacy like
Yeah.
for
So
the younger generation?
I just came back from Taiwan, a trip to Taiwan,
Mhm.
and my friend asked me to speak in her class at National Taiwan Normal University. And so it's all, undergraduates. I asked, how many of you heard of Fu Pei-mei before today? Nobody. Nobody raised their
Nobody.
hand. Nobody knows who this lady is. They don't know why I'm yammering on about her or anything.
Not
Uh,
even after the television shows, that the series
Yeah,
about her
no,
life.
I don't think so. But the interesting thing is that television program that was released in 2017 or 18 was kind of a dramatic rehearsal of her story. It's
Right,
also now on Netflix. It's called What She Put on the Table. So it's a dramatic retelling of Fu Pei-mei's story with this like completely fabricated characters in it as well. But anyway, the idea of that is to introduce her to a new audience. So by putting all her shows on YouTube, right?
YouTube.
That's one way to do it is like they can
Hmm.
see if a new generation of people will watch her program or not. But what's interesting is to read the comments in all of those, the YouTube posts, because some commenters, they're from mainland China because they're writing in simplified Chinese, and they're like, "Who is this lady? And what does she know about cooking?" And it's like, oh, they just have no idea who she is or why she's important.
Hmm.
And because the production values compared to an American food program are very low, right? It's from the 70s or 80s. They don't have that much money, but that woman knows how to cook. She knows how to use a cleaver, right? You look at the way
Right,
that she is, the actions she's doing are just very, very
right.
impressive. So, so we'll see if a new
I have to admit that her knife skills is amazing. If you look at the videos that you know the so-called 刀工,
yes.
the knife skill is quite amazing.
Right.
Anyway, go
And
ahead.
that's the funny part too. It's like, use all these kitchen gadgets you get in an American like kitchen store. It's like all she needs is one knife, cleaver.
One
That's it.
just
Right?
cleaver,
Do
yeah, just a
everything,
cleaver,
right? Just a really sharp cleaver and a wooden chopping board, and that's it. And she can turn
yeah.
out all kinds of stuff. Um, but anyway, I think it'll be interesting to see. My book is coming out in Taiwan next year in Chinese, and so I'm curious to see if it will spark a conversation intergenerationally, because clearly people above a certain age definitely know who she is. They all know who she is,
Right.
right? Such a figure of nostalgia for a lot of people. Um, but for a younger generation, they're not familiar. But what I'm hoping is that, my book can spark that intergenerational conversation between parents and children and, talking about things that happened in Taiwan or what life was like when people, like my parents first came to the US and learned how to cook. So,
Great. So I think that we basically sort of covered the whole um, life of Fu Pei-mei in this talk. So I'd like to just open up for question and answer at this point. Um, Let me see. I'm looking at the Q&A section here. The first one is from Joan Amstein. She said, "Are her cookbooks going to be republished?"
so
Do you
actually,
know about that?
yeah, her cookbooks have been republished in Taiwan. Her children have reissued them, at various times, and they just gifted me with a massive volume. But the one they gifted me, they took out all the English. It's only in Chinese, right? So I don't know if I don't know if they will be republished in they have in the past republished them in Chinese English editions, which you can still find, but they don't have, those republications. They don't have the same feeling that this one does. This cover and this old, book now out of print just inspires like the feeling, if you know the book, then, you're looking for this in a used bookstore or, that's pretty much the only way you can get it. But there are, if you look online, you will find kind of re-editions where they took all new photos and they kind of made corrections and things like that. But I think the feeling of that old school nostalgic feeling comes from the original, which is sadly not
Right.
published anymore. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I guess you can find them in as used book from like in some of these
Yep.
website that sells used books. So you should be able to find them if you really want to get them. They can be expensive, but
That's right.
uh,
You see
but
one, snap it up.
it's not. So yeah. Anyway, second questions from Amy Fong. Uh, how old was Fu Pei-mei when she was sent to Japan for schooling, and how long did she stay there?
So to clarify, Fu was never sent to Japan for schooling. At the time, the city she lived in, Dalian, was occupied. It's a city in China, but occupied by the Japanese. So she was sent to a Japanese school in China, in her hometown, by her dad, because there were enough Japanese, basically colonizers there to run a school. So she never went to the first time she went to Japan for school was as an adult after she'd had kids. She went for a period of study of a few months to a nutritional university in Japan. And she loved it. She had a great time. It was just a few months, but her daughter got sick, and so she had to come home. So that was really the only time that she stayed in Japan for schooling as an adult.
Mhm. The next question from Naning Lin. Could you please show some pictures of Fu Pei-mei herself?
Gosh. There's let's see, do you have one in your cookbook? You probably do.
Yeah,
Have it.
let me
Wanna
see.
look through that. I can, while you're doing that, I'll answer one of the other questions. I'm just going in
Yeah,
order.
you're also going to the questions, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Considering she traveled a lot to Japan, did she incorporate Japanese influences into her cooking as well? I think she was very interested in all kinds of food, but I don't think she ever came out with her own Japanese cookbook, She may have, there's a lot of dishes that have become very popular, like teppanyaki, basically. That's a form of cooking that's really popular in Taiwan. So all of those kind of dishes that became absorbed in the period that basically Taiwan was a Japanese colony for 50 years from 1895 to 1945. So all of the Japanese influences that kind of seeped into Taiwanese cuisine was certainly something that she, was teaching people and showing people. So have you found a picture of her?
Well, yeah, this is the picture of her television studio picture, I believe, right?
Yeah.
She's I don't know if you can see her, but that's a picture of a studio
If you go to my
shot.
website on michelletking.com, you'll find a lot of pictures of her on there too. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, the next questions is oh, I guess that's it. Do we have
There's
any other questions?
there's one here I see. Do you think those
Oh,
pushing the politicized nativist agenda will come around to recognize food's contributions to social development in Taiwan? Recognize that many of the foods they enjoy were brought by people with food's background. So it's an interesting question, and I think that it depends on like how you think about Taiwan's modern past, right? So I've had conversations with Clarissa Wei, who's a cookbook author who's just come out with a beautiful new cookbook called Made in Taiwan. But Clarissa is very adamant about, promoting a Taiwanese kind of identity that is
Right.
very Taiwanese. And so to her, when I spoke with her, she was like, "Oh, Fu Pei-mei, she's old school. That's not the way people are cooking anymore, and all this stuff." But I think most people recognize that, the culinary influences in Taiwan have been vast and, multiple. So lots of different influences, including mainland Chinese cuisine, including Japanese cuisine, including indigenous cuisines, including, Taiwanese dishes, Hakka, both Hakka and Hokkien, and, all
Right.
kinds of foods. That's what makes it such a great eater's paradise, So I don't know that too many people are super dogmatic about it. I think a lot of people have a pretty, just like the way they eat anything that tastes good. So,
Hmm.
another Taiwanese food studies friend said she doesn't think of a difference between Waisheng and Bensheng cooking or native Taiwanese and mainlander cooking. She's like, I cook all of it, So I think there's
Hmm.
lots of people who have very open ideas about food and not necessarily narrowly dogmatic, this is Taiwanese, this
Hmm.
is not, or anything like that, right? That's the beauty of history is like it's complicated, right? It's not black and white.
Hmm. Well, I agree with you. Like even a lot of dishes that is now sort of considered as being iconically Taiwanese, not necessarily Bunsen, but not necessarily like local native food, but Taiwanese. For example, like Shaoping Liu Tiao, which is the uh, you know and doujiang, the soybean milk and Shaoping, all that really is not um, quote unquote Taiwan, Taiwan's dishes per
Yeah,
se. I mean,
right.
but it is now become identified with Taiwanese cooking, with but all that kind of stuff. And um, 牛肉面, I mean, originally it's really a Sichuan dish. It's not really
Hmm.
um, a, um, a Taiwanese food, but yet it's been
Yep.
adopted and become very Taiwanese. So I agree with you. There's a lot of what makes Taiwanese food is so vibrant is the fact that it is influenced by so many different places.
Yep.
Um,
And that's the beauty of food too, right? It is not a respecter of borders or boundaries. Like food
it's
will travel
true.
and food will be adapted wherever it lands.
Yeah,
And, that's the beauty and why food makes such a great vehicle for talking about identities because they're never like rigid. They're always in flux,
right,
in motion. And so,
right. So yeah, so we have a few more questions, I think. What would be the publication date, publisher of original cookbook? Well, the original publication, volume one, the original was in 72,
69.
was it?
The
Oh,
original
69.
the
It was that
original
early.
first
Yeah,
volume is 1969. Is a three-volume series. 1969 is the
right.
first one. The second one is 1974, and the last one is 1979. So she was the original publisher of it. It was self-published, but if you just look up Pei-mei on any kind of eBay or used bookstore or Amazon or whatever, you can occasionally find those copies. Um, or certain there's a lot of wonderful, I've been giving a lot of book talks at really great cookbook stores and that specialize in cookbooks, and they often have copies as well of
Hmm.
of her cookbooks too.
Okay. Okay, we're going short in time here. We have to go through quickly. What do you think about the role of cookbooks in the age of having so many recipes easily available online?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. But the funny thing is, like, even though, like, Kian is a great example himself, right? He originally started as a blogger and had, an online presence, and yet you still wanted to make an actual cookbook, right? So maybe you can answer that because there's a difference, right? There's something about having a book, something about, having the leisure to look through and to page through. Like I only look on online websites when I know exactly what I'm looking for, right? I know what dish and I look that one up on a particular website. I like to use the Walks of Life, for example. But when I'm just looking for inspiration or I'm just kind of like, I just want to see, that's when I page through my cookbooks. I have dozens and dozens of Chinese cookbooks. And that's when I'm like, I love to compare. How does this person make,
Mhm.
koro, megan cai with koro? Like, how does this person do it? How do they differ? What ingredients do I have, right? I don't know, but maybe because I've grown up with the book, the physical book as the thing I go to. That's why I'm really married to it. And maybe a new generation is like, whatever, we got TikTok, who needs a cookbook? But I think there is something to also on a cookbook, you can take notes, use less salt, use less soy sauce. I don't like this, or I tried this day or whatever. And a cookbook is like a physical manifestation that, like, it's like my mom can give me hers, you can't do that with a TikTok or a website or whatever, right? There's no lasting value to it. It's just ephemeral. So I still am a lover of the book. So I think there will always be room for books, cookbooks, and books on bookshelves. So
Well, I agree. I think there's always a demand for a real cookbook because at least for me, I think in a cookbook you can get into a lot of details. You can discuss background. You can talk about techniques. You can talk about a lot of the details of cooking as opposed to just recipe. Very often, if you go online, all that you get is just the recipe, and you can follow the recipe verbatim and create some good dishes. But if you really want to understand the cuisine itself, the cooking technique itself, then you really need to have a cookbook, and that's how I feel is what is important is that you need the cookbook can give you a whole lot more details about the cooking itself. Another question is from Xin Ran Wang, and it says, "Hi, Professor King. Thanks for your sharing. Sorry, I do not have time to read your book yet. How do you think about her changes during the long career, and what is the main difference between Fu and other male cookbook authors?"
well, I guess I'll answer the last part of that. What's really interesting at the time is that um, Fu was not the only woman with cookbooks in her name, right? There was this whole
Yeah. In
kind of
fact, I don't think she's the
generation.
first.
No, she's
I don't
not.
think she was the first Chinese cookbook at all author.
No,
Yeah.
it's not at all. And she's not the first one to put her own name on it. What's really interesting is that there's this whole generation of post-war Chinese women who are putting out all these cookbooks. And so I think the thing is that at the time, women were seen as the ones, of course, they would be the cookbook authors because they're the ones cooking at home, right? And in an earlier generation, that wasn't, or in the imperial period, it was like literati men are the ones doing the eating, so they're the ones writing about food, right? You just didn't hear from women very much. Um, so I think I'm not sure that I can't really think of I can't think of any male cookbook authors that come along until later after that period. Like Lin Yutang is a well-known, Chinese kind of gourmand, but he didn't cook himself. His wife and his daughter
Right.
cooked. So it's again the old school model. So
Okay. I think the other posted questions are basically to thank you for sharing your research and study about Fu Pei-mei, and it was and I wanted to thank you also for having this little discussion, and we really appreciate this.
yeah,
So
thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun.